because it's only a 45-minute webinar. So good afternoon or good morning, wherever you're joining from. My name's Karine Neri, and I'm the convener of the IEAA's Transnational Education Network. The IEAA is very pleased to be able to collaborate with SANAM 4 in bringing you this webinar today. And on behalf of IEAA, we'd like to welcome you all. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the ancestors, elders and families of the Kulin Nation, where the City of Melbourne is located. We recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and culture, and pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. We also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands from which you all join us today, and all First Nations people participating in this forum. And just a couple of housekeeping items before we start. We have some time, a very short amount of time, scheduled for questions at the end of the webinar. Can you please ask your questions via the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen to ensure that they are seen. And we'll also be recording today's session, and it'll be sent to you, to all the registered participants tomorrow, along with the PowerPoint slides. So for all of us here today, India has been a country where deeper engagement, I think, has been a goal, but for many not quite yet the reality. And one of the reasons has been, I think, the relative greyness of the regulatory, and policy landscape, and the guidelines on how foreign education institutions can engage in mutually beneficial and meaningful ways with our Indian counterparts. But that's all about to change, which is really exciting. The Indian government's new education policy, which was approved by Union Cabinet in July 2020, outlines a very comprehensive framework for education at all levels, as well as vocational training, and opens the doors for foreign institutions to engage further and deeper with India. So with the loosening of some of these restrictions under the new NEP, the question we're aiming to answer in today's webinar is, what opportunities does the NEP present, and how can international institutions and organisations engage with India now? We'll hear from Lakshmi Iyer, Executive Director and Head of Education at SANAM S4, and Divya Sani also from SANAM S4. And some of you may already work with the organisation, which is for many the go-to firm in India for international organisations seeking to explore and enter and expand in the Indian market. They're a corporate partner as well for IEAA. Lakshmi is an avid commentator and observer of the higher education industry, and brings over 18 years of experience in the sector. She's a sought-after speaker. I'm sure many of you have seen her at higher ed conferences around the world in the US, UK, Europe, as well as Australia, New Zealand. And she's joining Lakshmi is Divya, Stakeholder Relations Manager at SANAM 4. And in her role, she engages stakeholders from international governments to track policy changes and identify opportunities for clients. Divya has a background in international relations and has worked with many consulting firms, trade associations and think tanks. We've also got today, and they might join us for the Q&A, Mel Southwell Lee, who is the new director of the South Asia desk at the Department of Education, Skills and Employment based in Canberra. And we're hoping Brett Goldsmith, Counsellor for Education and Research in the Australian High Commission in New Delhi, India, is also able to join us as well. So without further ado, I'll hand over to you, Lakshmi.
Thank you, Karine. Thank you, IEAA, for this opportunity. And as Karine mentioned in her opening remarks, this is quite the seminal moment in India, pivoting to not just being a sending country to destinations overseas, but also finding ways and means of expanding access to international higher education at home. The NEP, which was tabled end of July 2020, puts forward a framework for institutions from overseas to engage with Indian institutions in a meaningful fashion. Of course, India has been a net exporter of students. Are there ways and means to engage with Indian institutions in a meaningful way to expand access to Indian students? And that is the question we will attempt to answer as we progress through this presentation. So today's presentation between Divya and I, we are going to spend about 20-25 minutes walking you through the key highlights of this policy, giving you a little bit of background around the evolution of the NEP, the changes that we are going to see in higher education. Some of those changes are starting to kind of be formulated and are getting quite visible in the form of draft policies that are starting to emerge from the Universities Grants Commission, and some of the latest developments that Divya will touch on, and then what we see as the opportunities for Australia's higher education sector. So the key highlights, I would say that, previously, many of you who would have engaged with the Indian education landscape, you would have engaged with the Ministry of Human Resources Development. That ministry has been renamed as the Ministry of Education. There is an emphasis on T&E in the document. Talks about not just about studying in India, which is India's attempt to attract students from the neighboring countries as well as Africa to come and study in India, but also talking about staying in India for home students who usually consider traveling overseas in pursuit of higher educational opportunities, both at grad and undergrad level. Are there opportunities for them to stay in India and complete a high caliber education? There is a section on a 3-language formula, which talks about a recommendation that all students in India should learn 3 languages at their school level. So 2 of these languages should be native to India. The cornerstones of this policy are autonomy, adaptability, and flexibility. So India has always had traditionally a very rigid educational system with very little opportunity for individuals to segue from, say, a professional qualification to a vocational focused qualification and so on. So the policy actually, which is the first document of its kind, talking about education of the 21st century in the Indian context, looks at making the entire education landscape more flexible and adaptable to the needs of the new generation. There is also a section on a setting up of special education zones. And I wanted to kind of, in the context of the wider world, education zones usually would mean special economic zones where educational institutions are homed. But in this, in India's context, no discourse on education is complete without India thinking about the bottom of the pyramid. So the special education zones, as emphasized in the document, are about the regions of the country with large population of educationally underserved and disadvantaged individuals. And these areas would be declared as special education zones where all the schemes and policies are to be implemented with concerted efforts in order to truly change the landscape. And those of you who have traveled to India, and many of us who live here in India, India is many countries within one country. So within some pockets of this, you would end up serving what you would call as a population equivalent to some of the smaller countries around the world. Next slide, please. So in the context of the national education policy, it is very important for us to kind of, just take a few moments to look at the evolution of the policy. So the emphasis of the NEP 2020 is on holistic multidisciplinary courses, design thinking, an emphasis on integration of humanities with STEM education, which as a team, we all think that, it is a step in the right direction, because those who are becoming successful in the new age careers are all individuals who have come from a multidisciplinary kind of, approach. So how do you kind of, enable students to break out of the silos? The entire document actually looks at ways and means for enabling that. And so the flexibility in curriculum, entry and exit options, credit transfer options, and integration of vocational education, it is all of these have been kind of emphasized in the document with a hope that it will create a set of skilled professionals who would be useful across several industries and across the value chain of a lot of these industries. The policy emphasizes technological interventions, and those of us, all of us who are living through this pandemic, we know how technology has become so pervasive in our lives in the last 11 months or so. But in the context of this policy, which was tabled at the peak of the pandemic in India, it's interesting to note the undue emphasis on technological interventions, because I think now there is acceptance that brick and mortar solutions cannot kind of solve India's educational needs, and that we would need a solution at scale, which can only happen with technology intervention. And obviously, the guiding goals are access, equity, quality, affordability, and accountability. So the accountability element is something that has kind of come into play. And as we progress through the slides, I will explain how that is going to be embedded in the system. And there is also the thinking that more higher educational institutions will be established and developed, which would then enable India to have at least one large multidisciplinary higher educational institution in every district. So this document, which is probably the first education policy of the 21st century that India has kind of deployed, is hoping to address many of the challenges that we will face as more and more individuals come into the higher education space in the next 20 years. Our population consists of more than half of the world's under 25 years of age, individuals who all need some form of education. So the national education policy, as it has been tabled, is hopefully going to be the architecture for that. Next slide, please. So, for the purpose of this webinar, we have focused definitely, around the changes in higher education that we are starting to notice here. So the higher education system, which is, the architecture, is going to be about universities and autonomous degree granting colleges. And universities, as defined in this document, will mean a multidisciplinary institution of higher learning that offers undergrad and grad programs with quality teaching, research, and community engagement. Community engagement has got a lot of weightage here. The definition of university thus allows for a spectrum of institutions that range from those that place emphasis on teaching and some that place emphasis on research. And those of you who have engaged with India, you would kind of know that there are so many categories of universities that currently exist in our framework. This is about bringing some order into that and bucketing them in clear categories as research-led or teaching-led. And in the case of an autonomous degree granting college, that will refer to a large multidisciplinary institution of higher learning that grants undergrad degrees and is primarily focused on undergraduate teaching. So the thinking is that over a period of time, every college would either develop into an autonomous degree granting college or a constituent college of a university. And in the latter case, that would fully become part of a university. So the present complex nomenclature of higher educational institutions in India, such as deemed university, affiliating technical university, and so on, that would all hopefully be replaced by just university on fulfilling certain criteria as per norms. And model public universities for holistic and multidisciplinary education at par with IITs, IIMs, etc., which will be called as multidisciplinary education and research universities, will be set up with the aim that they will kind of set very high global standards in delivering quality education. In the last 10 years or so, India has become very hungry for having her institutions featured in the league tables, because there is understanding that having that drive will improve the quality being delivered at home. Next slide, please. So in the context of the obviously the changes that the document envisages in higher education, it's important for us to understand that the degree programs as we know, as they exist today, they are going to change. And the document is probably the first kind of public stance that the government of India has taken of acceptance of a 4-year undergrad education. And this is about envisaging a broad-based, multidisciplinary and holistic undergraduate education with flexible curricula, creative combinations of subjects. I mean, this is a new world. I mean, those of us who have grown up in the 1980s and the 1990s, we could not even imagine that such a thing would happen in India, where we could pick and choose subjects and integrate them into our curriculum. And these are the kind of flexible options that are now being offered to students. And undergraduate education can be 3 or 4 years with multiple entry and exit points that are going to be allowed. And the 4-year multidisciplinary bachelor's program, however, is going to be the preferred option for the government, because then it would allow the student to experience the full range of multidisciplinary education in terms of being able to focus on a major and minor subjects as per their choices. And what is going to drive this is also the establishment of an academic bank of credits. The document in terms of a draft for the establishment and also operationalizing of this ABC, as they are calling it, is already out in the last 10 days or so, and is out for consultation. And this academic bank of credit will operate as an exchange. Those of us who have read this draft, we can say that they are envisaging this as an exchange which will store academic credits earned at certain categories of institutions. There are obviously certain guidelines around who can be a member of the ABC, and those members that are there, those institutions can allow the exchange of these credits. So this will also kind of enable mobility within local institutions of a certain standing for students, where students could kind of pick and choose modules of their interest from a family of institutions that are brought together on this exchange. So the implications would be that those that switch over to the when we switch over to the 4-year undergraduate degree, it could be a very important step in terms of articulation agreements. Many of our undergrad programs are largely in the 3-year domain, and they will kind of eventually shift into a 4-year program. And it is envisaged that the 4th year could be a research-led year where they deep dive into a problem. Next slide, please. So I just want to kind of also put in front of this audience the changes in terms of the regulatory architecture that is going to come about. UGC and AICTE will get subsumed into what is being called as the Higher Education Commission of India, HECI, within which there will be 4 structures that would be independent verticals that would look at regulation, which is under the NHERC, which is the National Higher Education Regulatory Council, which would look at particularly financial probity, good governance, public disclosure, self-disclosure of finances and audits and so on, so that the sector becomes effectively regulated. The second one, the primary mechanism to enable such regulation will be accreditation. So the second vertical of the HECI will be the National Accreditation Council, NAC. So accreditation of institutions will be primarily on basic norms, public self-disclosure, and outcomes. So, and it will be carried out by an independent ecosystem of accrediting institutions supervised and overseen by NAC. The third vertical under this is the Higher Education Grants Council, which will carry out the funding and financing of higher education institutions based on transparent criteria, including their development plans that they submit to the government. And HEGC will be entrusted with the disbursement of scholarships and also development funds. And last but not the least is the General Education Council, which will frame the outcomes that are expected of all of these higher educational programs in terms of their learning outcomes. And they are calling this as graduate attributes. And a national higher education qualification framework will be formulated by the GEC. And that will then be kind of integrated with the national skills qualifications framework to ease the integration of vocational education into higher education. So this gives you a broad overview of the kind of architecture that we are kind of looking at in the coming 20 years. The horizon of this document ranges from 15 to 20 years. So by 2040 is the end point that is seen in this document. I'll now hand this off to my colleague Divya so that she can talk about the research landscape that is emerging. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Great. So the next slide, we're essentially going to focus on research. And it's really good to see the government's approach in terms of recognizing we as a country need a comprehensive synergy manner.
Have we lost Divya? We look like we might have. She's coming back in. We lost you for a minute, Divya. You're on mute. Hopefully you can join us.
Very strange. I was logged out.
Okay, great.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Carry on with what I was stating. Perfect. Thank you so much for sharing the screen. Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I will just continue. So the new policy essentially proposes establishing a national research foundation to fund outstanding peer-reviewed research and to actively seed research in universities and colleges. The NRF will carefully coordinate with other funding agencies and will work with science, engineering, and other academics to ensure synergy of purpose and avoid duplication of efforts. Something that's really interesting to note is that we can already see the emphasis the government wants to press on this particular National Research Foundation. And in the latest budget that came out, the overall budget for the National Research Foundation has been amped up to $6.84 billion over the next 5 years. The primary activities of the NRF will essentially be to fund competitive peer-reviewed grant proposals of all types and across all disciplines. It will also facilitate research at academic institutions, particularly at universities and colleges where research is at a nascent stage. And finally, it will act as a liaison between researchers and relevant branches of the government as well as industry, so that research scholars are constantly made aware of the most urgent national research issues and so that policymakers are constantly aware of the latest research breakthroughs that they can implement in their own work. Now, in terms of the implications of the National Research Foundation for international institutions, it's interesting because the policy at this current stage does not explicitly mention whether international institutions will be able to tap into NRF funds. However, we feel that it is very much likely that Indian researchers will be able to collaborate with international researchers for NRF funded projects. Moving on to the next slide, and I think this section is going to be of particular interest to many people on this call today, is the section on the NEP that focuses on internationalization. So, you know, the NEP has given a very clear signal that they want to promote India as a country that is open to all sorts of international institutions as well as international students to come and partner with local Indian institutions and essentially achieve an overall mission of providing premium education at affordable costs. In order to do this, they have recommended a series of changes that we're already seeing are kind of coming out of regulatory bodies such as UGC and AICTE. First and foremost, they are essentially requesting all Indian HAIs that currently host foreign students to set up an international students office, which will, you know, coordinate all matters relating to welcoming and supporting students coming from outside. Secondly, we're seeing a lot of kind of emphasis on research and teaching collaborations, as well as faculty and student exchanges with high quality foreign institutions. Now, it's important to underscore here that both in the NEP as well as in the latest draft regulations that have come out from the UGC, the emphasis on high quality is been seen. So as you will see on the fifth point on this particular slide, another change that has been mentioned in the NEP is allowing the top 100 universities of the world to come up and operate in India. Now, you know, while we have seen a lot of kind of draft regulations coming out of UGC on things such as academic collaborations between Indian and international institutions, we haven't quite seen any kind of follow-up frameworks that are going to help facilitate the operation of these 100 institutions. However, we have seen a lot of debate in the market as to how top 100 is a very kind of restrictive number overall, and we are hoping that in, you know, the preceding draft regulations that will be coming out, they are going to focus on expanding top 100 to a much larger number, and perhaps also look at how institutions that specialize in a particular domain instead should be invited to come and participate in these kind of collaborations. This leads me to my next slide, actually the last point, and that is on what are the latest developments that we're seeing on the NEP. And this is, you know, nearly 7 to 8 months after the policy that was officially released. So the great news here is that we're not just seeing this policy as a standalone document that was released and then we didn't really kind of hear anything about it. We are actively seeing draft regulations coming out of UGC, which is the University Grants Commission. And the latest set of updates essentially focus on academic collaborations between Indian and foreign higher education institutions. So as per the latest regulations, higher education institutions of India can collaborate with foreign institutions on namely 4 types of different collaborations. First one is credit recognition and transfer. And here we're essentially looking at any credits conferred by a foreign HAI will be recognized, quantified, and included towards the credit requirements for a program delivered by an Indian higher education institution, and vice versa. The second key kind of collaboration that is being allowed now is a joint degree program. And here essentially the curriculum will be designed jointly by the collaborating Indian and foreign higher education institution. And the degree will be awarded essentially on a single certificate bearing the crest of both institutions. The third program that we're looking at as dual degree programs, and these are essentially going to be degrees that will be conferred by both the Indian as well as the foreign higher education institution simultaneously but separately. And the final one is twinning arrangements, whereby a collaborative arrangement will be set up between an Indian and foreign higher education institutions. This is essentially going to target students that are currently enrolled with an Indian higher education institution that decide to pursue part of their degree abroad. However, the important thing to note with the twinning arrangement is that the degree or the diploma offered under such an arrangement will only be awarded by the Indian higher education institution. Now, a couple of important points to note on these latest draft regulations. First and foremost, they have very clearly specified that no franchise arrangements, whether overtly or covertly, with any kind of other terminology, will be allowed under these new set of regulations. The second bit is that these regulations are not going to be applicable to programs offered in online or distance learning mode. We're seeing some new kind of draft regulations coming out on this point from AICT, but those are primarily focused on technical education. And we till now have not seen really any kind of regulations focused on collaborative degrees that are offered online. So I think we would just need to kind of stay tuned for that and see any updates that come out of UGC. And finally, and I think this is something that is really important to note, is how does an institution become eligible to take part in these kind of collaborations? And in the latest draft regulations, essentially two modes have been highlighted by the UGC. The first mode is the automatic mode, wherein if an Indian institution and a foreign institution meet the eligibility criteria that are mentioned on the screen. So for an Indian institution, that would be them being accredited by NAC, which is our National Assessment and Accreditation Council, with a minimum score of 3.01 or above. Or if they featured in the top 100 of the National Institutional Ranking Framework of India, or if they are an institution of eminence, they will be allowed to collaborate with any foreign higher education institution on an automatic mode. For an international institution, they essentially have to feature in the top 500 of the Times Higher Education or the QS World University rankings. So that is, one mode of doing this. The second one is an approval mode, wherein if an Indian or an international higher education institution do not meet these criteria, they can actually go ahead and apply online to the commission as per the duly prescribed format. So what we're essentially seeing is a setup of an expert committee that will most likely be housed under the UGC. And while evaluating the application, they will be taking various factors into consideration, such as credibility of the higher education institution, faculty profile, student profile, research profile, and then finally the overall merit of the proposal. Next slide, please. So all in all, I think the whole kind of update on the partnerships in T&E front is something that we feel is very exciting for all sorts of international institutions. And the fact that UGC is reaching out and is requesting feedback and suggestions from counterparts, both in India as well as internationally, also kind of showcases that they don't want to do this. They don't want to release these regulations in isolation. They want it to be kind of a collaborative effort where they consider the viewpoints of different parties. Very quickly, I know that we are coming to the end of our time. I'm also quickly going to highlight two other opportunities that we see as particularly promising for Australia's higher education sector. Many of you would be kind of tracking the sheer explosion of edtech that has taken place in India. And as you may know, most of this is currently being facilitated by private service providers. So the likes of Upgrad, Simplilearn, and many, many more. So we as well as the new national education policy recognize that this is something that will hopefully make education more accessible, as Lakshmi mentioned earlier, but it will also need a lot of kind of inputs as well as knowledge exchange when it comes to digital content and capacity building. And this is a place where we feel that Australian institutions can definitely have a lot to contribute. So we will need involvement of experts drawn from the fields of administration, education, edtech, digital pedagogy, and then finally e-governance. Finally, as I mentioned, the government has really doubled down when it comes to building out the new National Research Foundation and setting up a separate kind of fund for that. And we feel that a lot of the activities that will be conducted within the NRF will require collaboration with international institutions. So a case in point is how the NEP is looking at the new disruptive technologies and what opportunities that may hold when it comes to research. And we've seen a lot of emphasis on AI and how through the setting up of joint research efforts, institutions will be able to study global challenges in areas such as healthcare, agriculture, and climate change. So with that, I will take a pause and hand it back over to Karen to facilitate the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thanks both, Lakshmi and Divya. That was great to get that very brief summary really of what's actually a very big change for India. There are quite a few questions on the Q&A. We probably won't be able to answer all of them. A couple of them have focused on the franchising issue that is part of the regulation. One from Emma and I think one from Reese Williams as well. So how do you think that's going to play out? Do you think?
Yeah, so the draft as it stands now, Karen, does not kind of, allow franchise agreements to be, allowed to do any of these arrangements. And in the context of India, I do think that it's good. I might be the outlier voice here, primarily because, this is a new world for India in terms of kind of, bringing a framework around the recognition of joint twinning and dual degree programs. So we have our task cut out for us, even in the context of recognized institutions within India entering into this and figuring out how they go about making this quite student friendly in a lot of ways. Because one concern that we have as a team is that the recognition is only for a period of like 5 years, and 6 months prior you have to go through the hoops again to get yourself recognized. But then when you look at the entire teach out, if you are starting to do this for an undergrad, by the 3rd year of the existence of that program, you already need to worry about what happens to those students who have come on this program. So there are all of these complications that we have to work our way through. And in that mix, to add franchise degrees could become quite complicated, primarily because there are all sorts of players, and we might we might kind of, shoot ourselves on our foot by having suspect players coming into the market. So if we could get this architecture and framework approved for our existing institutions that fall under all these norms, that in itself will be like a huge leap forward for us as a country.
Okay, thank you. There is also a question, I know that it doesn't cover, the regulation currently is silent, or it doesn't cover the online space, but most institutions in the last year and a bit have been teaching in hybrid and online mode. Do you think that's, and if you set up, say, a dual award arrangement, do you think that's going to be specifically prohibited, or do you think that's going to actually be allowed in some ways?
So the currently it says that the regulations are not applicable to programs that are offered in online mode and open and distance learning mode. And if I don't think the government is wanting to kind of step in there and start regulating that. Large majority of our unicorns in the tech space, they have all kind of started looking at upskilling and reskilling and so on. And some of them are even starting to think about offering some of their programs for first-time learners at the degree level. And the government hasn't kind of really started scrutinizing that yet. I think they have got enough on their plate to kind of get going on some of the promises made in NEP. But who says? I mean, nobody knows, right? In the next kind of 2 years, if we see a mass, as it is, we are seeing an explosion in this space. And if we see some controversial kind of moves that are starting to be made, the government will step in.
Yeah, and in the area of credit recognition and articulations, one question I also had was around, you know, student mobility, because often you will go abroad, take some credits back from abroad. Does that mean every student mobility agreement will have to be registered, you know, approved?
Yeah.
So we have had internal debates on this. Divya, do you want to take that question?
Yeah. And I think, Karen, you might be referring to the study abroad kind of arrangements that take place between institutions as well.
Yeah.
And it's very interesting because they have very clearly identified these four as you know, collaborative agreements that can take place between institutions, but that still leaves many others out there as well. And as Lakshmi, I think, was alluding to, we internally have also had debates about new models that a lot of people are kind of trying to orchestrate, but not knowing whether it will be allowed or not. And I think our kind of feedback and advice to institutions on that would be to definitely consult an expert in this space, whether that is a legal firm or whether that is, you know, a firm that does a lot of kind of partnership building work, to ensure that you are complying with all of the regulations. Because I mean, if you go through the UGC draft regulations, on the last page, they very, very clearly outline that anybody that does not comply with these will come under the scanner of UGC, and I think that is something that no institution really would like to do.
Yeah. There's also
and I also want to add one point, sorry, Karan, you know, the matters relating to the governance and grievances of students, they and including legal matters relating to the collaboration, the onus has been passed to the Indian institution. So that is quite interesting, you know, in the way they have, you know, like structured this draft for consultation, where the responsibility lies with the Indian institution to make sure that, you know, this is something that is tenable, and, you know, sustainable, and, you know, is on the right side of the regulation.
And on the question of rankings, it's kind of understandable that they want to put that there. There's probably going to be feedback, I imagine, to the UGC around, you know, it's a very sort of black and white kind of ranking. There are a lot of universities that are quite specialized, you know, in certain disciplines, and it would be very beneficial for Indian institutions to get that sort of expertise. I guess, would you say that there is an approval route that they could go through, the approval route rather than the automatic route? Would you say that was the answer?
Yes, absolutely.
There is an approval route.
There's the approval route. Also, it's important to see how, I think, UGC is taking the feedback. So if you saw the first kind of national education policy mentioned top, and mentions, you're seeing that expanded to top 500.
Yeah. Okay. We're nearly out of time. I wanted to invite Brett to come in at this point. Do you have any particular feedback you'd like to give, or any comments you'd like to make to the Australian sector who are here today?
Yes. Yeah, thanks very much, Corinne, and thank you, Lakshmi. It's lovely to see you again, and we'll be meeting soon. Hello, Divya, and I want to acknowledge Mel Southwell-Lee, my colleague back in Canberra on the South Asia desk. Thanks very much for some brief comments, opportunity. A couple of things I want to say. Look, I think to some of those questions, such as online, for example, such as franchising, this appears to me to be quite a revolutionary change for India. I think it's big, and I think the Ministry of Education will want to go in some senses very fast, and in others a little bit carefully, a little bit slowly. But I see that online will come eventually. We're constantly talking to the Ministry about these matters and advocating in that regard. And I think it's a matter of building confidence, because we're going through new thresholds. I also think for Australian operators, I want to say that both Mel in Canberra and myself here at Post in New Delhi are always available to act as in-betweens and to help facilitate. I do want to say that this demonstrates that India's structures, the way that its structural reform is beginning to align with other systems and is beginning to align with Australia's system, which makes our interactions with it a lot easier. Yeah. So I want to put that down, and it also comes within, for us, within this broader framework of the Australia-India Comprehensive Strategic Partnership. So whilst we're dealing in some senses with some of these micro issues, I think it's really handy for everybody to think about that at that macro level, the sorts of frameworks that are in place, and to use them, and to expect us in government to be accountable to those frameworks, and for you to operate and get us to operate within those frameworks. And the only one other thing that a comment I will make about, and I know with confidence that India is looking at more broadly, more flexibility around the top 100 institutions. I think some of that is more an advertisement or a statement of India's intent about quality. But I am fascinated with, in terms of joint degrees, twinning and whatever, how that would shape the student mobility, and will that, for Indian students studying with Australia, will that begin to shape their patterns, and will it sort of narrow the number of institutions that they might study with? So that's something that we'd be speaking with the ministry about. Thank you very much.
Okay, we probably could go on for quite a bit longer. There's lots more questions that have been unanswered, but we've run out of time. I'd like to, I think we, before you go, if you wouldn't mind providing your feedback on today's session by a quick poll that's about to come onto your screen. It would be great if you could fill that in as well. And thanks again. I'm sure we will have we will hear more about this, these developments in India, and we're definitely, for those of you who are aware of the IAA's T&E network, we are definitely going to be taking up this topic again. So keep an eye out for the the session times for that. It'll be in late July this year. So thanks again, everybody, and have a good rest of the day. Great. Thank you for attending today. You'll get the copy of the slides and the recording. Thanks to Divya and Lakshmi as well, and Brett and Mel, and of course to the IAA network for organising this webinar for us today. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Corinne.